July 1943, Western Front Headquarters. General Lieutenant Ernst Keller sat with his staff officers reviewing Luftwaffe intelligence summaries. The Americans, he remarked dryly, still believe their oversized bombers can decide battles. The reports of flying fortresses lumbering across the skies of France were dismissed with the same confidence he had expressed months earlier in staff meetings. The Wehrmacht had fought on 2 continents and crushed armies in wakes. How could a machine, slow and visible, change the tempo of ground war? In his margins, he scribbled a note, later preserved in archives. These bombers are weapons for propaganda films, not for real war. Our flak and fighters will scatter them. German assessments reflected a deeper cultural certainty. Their doctrine emphasized maneuver, discipline, and the shock of armored thrusts. Air power, they argued, could soften positions but not break armies. American insistence on building vast fleets of heavy bombers seemed like the indulgence of an industrial power that confused factories with strategy. To Keller's staff, the very scale of the program confirmed their assumptions. If the Americans needed hundreds of aircraft to strike a single target, it meant they lacked precision and efficiency. In the officers' mess that evening, the subject returned. A young captain quoted from a captured U.S. manual on daylight bombing doctrine. The room erupted in laughter. Daylight raids against a disciplined European air defense? Madness. The Luftwaffe had shredded British attempts over the Ruhr at night with far greater stealth. Daylight would turn the American formations into flying coffins. Keller raised his glass and concluded, "Let them come. They will fill our skies with targets, nothing more." What German commanders didn't realize was that the industrial logic behind those bombers was the same logic that had filled Normandy beaches with bread and fuel, production on a scale they had never conceived. Factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Detroit were not just building aircraft, they were constructing a new kind of battlefield. For now, however, in the summer of 1943, American bombers were still a subject of ridicule in German headquarters. The laughter echoed louder than the drone of engines gathering across the Atlantic. Autumn 1943 brought more fragments of intelligence to Keller's desk. Luftwaffe patrols reported formations of B-17 streaming across the channel in daylight, escorted now by growing numbers of long-range P-47 Thunderbolts. The after-action summaries counted bomb craters near railway yards, factories, and supply depots. Yet the tone in German headquarters remained one of mockery rather than alarm. Reports of scattered bombs missing their targets reinforced the belief that these so-called flying fortresses were wasteful giants, incapable of precision. Colonel Hans Dietrich of Army Group Center summarized the consensus in a staff conference. They burn fuel as if America has oceans of it to waste. Every raid costs them more than it costs us. Industry cannot fly an army to victory. His words echoed the German tradition of thrift and tactical economy, forged in campaigns where supply lines stretched thin across Russia. By comparison, the American approach seemed extravagant, almost childish. The Wehrmacht's confidence was amplified by statistics of their own. In August and September, Luftwaffe fighters downed dozens of bombers in single raids. Photographs circulated of burning wreckage scattered across French fields. Charred fuselages split open like broken toys. Pilots returned to their bases, boasting that the fortresses are not fortresses at all. They are barns in the sky. In briefing rooms, maps dotted with crash sites served as proof that German air defenses could bleed the Americans faster than they could replace their machines. But beneath the surface of confidence, some cracks appeared. Analysts noted that even after losing entire groups, the Americans returned the next week with equal or greater numbers. Industrial capacity in the United States was proving to be a silent participant in the campaign, replenishing losses at a pace German factories could not imagine. Still, in the autumn months, to the German officer corps, American bombers remained a clumsy experiment, loud, costly, and, in their judgment, doomed to collapse under the weight of its own excess. The laughter had not yet faded, and the myth of invulnerability in German defenses still held strong. Winter 1943 turned the skies over occupied Europe into a constant theater of thunder. The Americans, undeterred by losses, began to fly in ever larger formations. At first glance, this seemed to confirm German ridicule. Why else would an air force need entire swarms of bombers to hit a single target? But the reality was different. From bases in England, groups of B-17 and B-24s rose in waves, engines growling like distant storms. In precise box formations, they layered their defensive guns, overlapping fields of fire, until each squadron became a moving fortress wall. German fighter pilots, who once dove with contempt, found themselves met with curtains of tracers, the sky itself alive with fire. Losses mounted on both sides, but for every fortress falling in flames, 3 more pressed forward. On the ground, Wehrmacht officers continued to brief their men with confidence. A panzer column moving through northern France was told that American bombers could not interdict armored movements effectively. Tanks dispersed in woods, artillery concealed under camouflage nets. These, they believed, made their formations untouchable. The lesson of the Eastern Front still guided their thinking. Ground maneuver decided battles, not machines in the air. Yet among the rank and file, unease was growing. Soldiers resting in barns and roadside bivouacs heard the drone before they saw it. The noise was unlike German bombers. Deeper, heavier, filling the horizon. Rumors spread through letters home. The Americans come in daylight, like factories with wings. You can see them shining in the sun, and they do not turn back. By January, German intelligence officers were beginning to realize that the raids were not random demonstrations. Rail lines shattered, repair yards burned, and supply depots smoldered under black columns of smoke. The laughter in staff rooms had grown quieter. The fortresses were not winning battles yet, but they were rewriting the rhythm of war. Spring 1944 revealed a new scale of American intent. Where once raids had struck a single rail yard or factory, now entire regions fell under the shadow of bomber streams. Columns of B-17 stretched for miles, each formation timed to arrive with clockwork precision. German observers stationed along the Channel coast sent urgent radio reports. The sky is filled. The air is trembling with engines. This is no raid. It is an invasion from the clouds. Wehrmacht columns moving west to reinforce defenses against the expected Allied landing began to feel the true weight of this shift. Convoys that once traveled by daylight were ordered to move only at night. Bridges were cratered beyond repair, forcing tanks to crawl along farm roads unsuited for heavy vehicles. Soldiers who once laughed at the idea of flying factories now marched past smoldering wreckage of fuel trucks and horse-drawn wagons torn apart by bombs dropped in endless succession. One report captured from the headquarters of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division recorded the disbelief of its commander. Entire sections of our column were erased in minutes. Not scattered, not damaged. Erased. Men describe it as if the ground itself exploded beneath them. Morale is crumbling. The enemy does not fight us with soldiers, but with fire from the sky. Luftwaffe pilots tried desperately to stem the tide, diving into the swarms with dwindling fuel and ammunition. But the Americans had introduced a new element: long-range P-51 escorts that clung to the formations all the way to their targets. The joke of the easy prey fortress evaporated in clouds of contrails streaked with fire and steel. German fighters, once the terror of the skies, were shredded in duels that left their airfields littered with blackened hulks. By May, whispers circulated in Wehrmacht staff circles that a single bomber raid could decide the fate of divisions on the ground. The fortress walls of Europe were no longer made of concrete and steel. They were measured in the tonnage of bombs descending from American skies. June 1944. As the Allied invasion unfolded on the beaches of Normandy, German commanders received their first undeniable proof that American bombers were no longer a nuisance, but a decisive weapon. When word of the landings reached armored divisions stationed inland, orders went out at once: move columns toward the coast, crush the bridgehead before it could expand. Convoys of panzers, trucks, and artillery rolled onto French roads, expecting to repeat the maneuvers that had once shattered Soviet armies. But above them, the drone began. It started as a low murmur, then grew into a sky-wide vibration. German soldiers tilted their helmets upward and froze. Streams of B-17 and B-24s appeared on the horizon, formation stacked upon formation, glinting silver in the sun. For many, it was the first time they had witnessed the full weight of American air power concentrated on the ground war. The bombs came in waves. Road junctions erupted in fountains of dirt and smoke. Columns scattered, trucks overturned like toys. Survivors described the sensation as if the earth itself had turned against them. One officer later wrote in his report, captured after the war, "The ground shook so violently that my men believed we were under artillery barrage from 100 batteries. But there were no guns, only the Americans above, blotting out the sun." Attempts to regroup ended in chaos. Bridges were destroyed moments before tanks reached them. Fuel depots vanished in orange fireballs, and every open field became a death trap. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to intercept, but found the bombers bristling with guns and protected by fighters that slashed through the German air defense. Columns meant to strike the beaches never arrived. In those days after D-Day, German divisions learned a bitter truth. Their mobility, the core of Blitzkrieg doctrine, had been nullified. The same columns that once symbolized unstoppable momentum could now be erased in minutes. For the Wehrmacht, it was no longer a march to the front. It was a gamble with annihilation from the sky. By mid-June 1944, the effects of those raids were etched into every German staff map. Where arrows once showed neat advances toward the beaches, now thick red slashes marked destroyed convoy, bridge lost, fuel depot eliminated. Officers of Panzer Group West, who once mocked American heavy bombers, found themselves reporting that entire battalions had failed to reach their assembly areas, not because of enemy tanks or artillery, but because the roads themselves had ceased to exist under the bombardment. Captured diaries from German junior officers revealed the growing despair. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote on June 14th, "We prepared all night for the advance. At dawn, the order came to move. We had barely reached the road when the horizon roared. The earth shook, horses screamed, trucks overturned in flames. In 1 hour, our column was gone. I saw comrades buried where they stood." Such testimonies, later preserved in Allied archives, became silent evidence of the transformation in warfare. Even hardened veterans, men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, admitted shock at the scale of destruction. One survivor described the sight of a single stick of bombs walking down a tree-lined avenue, reducing an armored column to a string of smoking craters. "We thought we knew what war was," he recalled after capture. But this was not war. It was annihilation delivered from the sky. The Wehrmacht's high command struggled to adapt. Orders to disperse columns and march by night collided with the logistical reality of an army already starved for fuel. Moving slowly in small groups meant never reaching the front in time. Moving quickly in daylight meant risking obliteration. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the German concept of rapid concentration of force, the very heart of blitzkrieg, was rendered impossible. By late June, the phrase began circulating in whispered conversations among officers. "Every road is death in daylight." What had begun as laughter at the flying barns was giving way to an unspoken recognition. The Americans had rewritten the rules of movement itself, and with each passing raid, German confidence dissolved beneath the thunder of engines overhead. July 1944, the German command attempted one last concentrated counterstroke near Caen. Panzer divisions, held in reserve for weeks, were finally ordered forward to smash the Allied lines. Staff officers briefed the troops with the same words they had used since Poland and France. Speed and shock would deliver victory. Yet, as the columns rolled out from their hidden bivouacs, the sound returned. Low at first, then all-encompassing. A sky that seemed to vibrate with menace. This time, the raid was not a harassing strike, but a deliberate assault coordinated with the ground battle. Allied intelligence had pinpointed the German concentration, and American bombers rose in waves, hundreds strong. Crews of B-17 and B-24s looked down on the carefully marshaled armored units as though staring at rows of targets on a training range. At the signal, bomb bay doors opened. What followed became etched in memory as a turning point. The countryside erupted in sheets of flame and geysers of earth. Tanks flipped from concussive blasts. Entire artillery batteries disappeared under smoke. Surviving German accounts describe a horizon alive with explosions so dense that orientation was impossible. There was no front, no rear, only fire, recalled Major Heinrich Petsch of the 9th SS Panzer. In minutes, our division ceased to exist as an organized force. For the soldiers caught in it, the raid carried a psychological weight even greater than the physical destruction. The Luftwaffe was absent, the flak overwhelmed, and the vast formation seemed untouchable. Men who had once sneered at American air factories now whispered of them as a force beyond human contest. By evening, reconnaissance confirmed what no German planner wished to admit. The counterattack was broken before it had even begun. Columns that should have reached the front line never emerged from the inferno. The laughter that had once filled German headquarters was gone, replaced by a silence heavy with realization. In Normandy, the war was no longer dictated by panzers, but by the bombers that ruled the daylight skies. August 1944 carried the consequences of that lesson across all of France. As the Allies broke out from Normandy and began their rapid advance toward the Seine, German headquarters tried desperately to shift reserves to seal the breach. Yet every attempt to form a counterattack dissolved beneath the same pattern. A road column spotted, American bombers summoned, and in minutes, the would-be counterstroke was nothing more than twisted steel and burning fuel. At Argentan, survivors described the moment when over 1,000 bombers descended upon retreating forces trapped between converging Allied armies. Eyewitnesses called it a storm without rain, a continuous rolling thunder as sticks of bombs marched methodically down every visible road. Villages vanished in plumes of dust, tanks toppled into craters that had not existed moments before, and entire battalions were buried where they camped. One captured officer later admitted, "We were not defeated in combat. We were erased." The psychological rupture spread far beyond the battlefield. Columns that once moved with pride now crept through woods like fugitives, engines cut at the faintest hum in the distance. Soldiers refused to rest in barns or villages, convinced that any roof would draw American eyes from above. At night, Rumors ran like wildfire that the Americans could see in the dark, that their machines never tired, that every road in France had become a death trap. For German commanders, the raids revealed a strategic nightmare. The very scale that once defined their strength, the ability to mass armor and artillery for decisive blows, had become a liability. Any concentration large enough to matter was large enough to be destroyed in a single raid. Reports to OKW admitted the unthinkable. Maneuver, the essence of blitzkrieg, no longer functioned under Allied air supremacy. By the end of August, as the Falaise pocket closed and tens of thousands of German troops were captured or annihilated, the lesson was undeniable. American bombers were no longer dismissed as costly experiments. They had become the arbiters of movement, the silent generals whose formations in the sky dictated the fate of divisions on the ground. For the Wehrmacht, the age of laughter at flying fortresses was over. Now came only dread at their approach. September 1944, as the remnants of German forces streamed eastward toward the Siegfried Line, the legend of American bombers hardened into daily reality. What began months earlier as sporadic raids had become a relentless presence. Columns that dared to move under daylight skies vanished under tonnage, measured not in dozens, but in thousands. The sound of engines now carried the same meaning for German soldiers as artillery once had. Death was near. A Wehrmacht intelligence officer recorded after capture that entire brigades disappeared in an afternoon. His reports to higher command spoke of the same pattern. No warning, no buildup, only the sudden drone overhead, followed by earth-shaking bombardment. Even hardened veterans who had endured Stalingrad confessed they had never experienced destruction so concentrated, so sudden. "At least in Russia we fought men," one prisoner remarked. "Here, we fought the sky itself." What amplified the fear was the speed of replacement. For every formation lost in combat, the Americans replaced it within weeks. New bombers arrived in Britain straight from assembly lines, their crews barely older than schoolboys, trained enough to take their place in the endless rotation. German officers, reading intelligence summaries, were stunned by the industrial reality. America was producing aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Letters seized from the field told the human story of collapse. A sergeant of the 12th SS wrote to his wife in late September, "We march at night, but the roads are clogged with wrecks from the day. By morning, the smell of fuel and burned men fills the air. Some say God has sided with the Americans, for they call down fire as if from heaven itself." As Allied ground forces surged through liberated cities, German staff officers admitted privately what they could not yet tell Berlin. Daylight belonged to the Americans. Movement, supply, reinforcement. Every action depended on darkness or deception. The Luftwaffe, once master of the skies, was shattered, and the flying fortresses, once mocked as failures, had become the very symbol of inevitability, rewriting the conduct of war hour by hour. October 1944 marked a season of reckoning. The Wehrmacht, retreating toward Germany's western borders, found itself bound not only by Allied armies on the ground, but by a sky that offered no reprieve. Columns attempting to move toward Aachen, Arnhem, or the Saar were tracked, targeted, and obliterated in minutes. It was no longer a matter of chance. American bombers had refined their coordination to the point of near-instant response. At Aachen, the first German city to face assault on its own soil, witnesses recalled the skies turning black with contrails as squadrons of B-17 and B-24s descended upon defensive positions. Streets where troops had dug in collapsed under tons of explosives. Commanders who had once spoken confidently of fortress cities admitted in post-war interrogations that no fortress could withstand bombardment that arrived in such scale and with such persistence. The sound of walls crumbling under bombs replaced the myth of impenetrable defenses. For the men on the ground, morale fractured. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed exhaustion not from combat, but from helplessness. "We march by night, dig by morning, hide by day," wrote a corporal of the 246th Infantry Division. "But the Americans always find us." The bombs fall as if guided by fate. Rumors circulated of invisible spotters, of machines that could see through clouds, of an enemy whose factories in Detroit and Seattle never slept. Even German generals, once dismissive of industrial war, began to speak in tones of despair. Reports to OKW described American production as a weapon in itself. "Every week we destroy their machines, and every week twice as many appear. Our men see the endless streams over the channel and know at once, this cannot be defeated." By the end of October, what had begun as ridicule had transformed into silent recognition. The flying fortresses were no longer simply bombers. They had become symbols of inevitability, embodying the weight of an industrial nation bent on total war. For the Wehrmacht, Each new raid was not merely destruction from above, but a reminder that their struggle was now against the factories of an entire continent. November 1944, the bitter cold settled over Europe, but the sky did not fall silent. Instead, the tempo of American raids intensified. With fuel lines extended and supply depots scarce, the Wehrmacht braced for the expected Allied push toward the Rhine. Yet before tanks and infantry struck, the bombers came first, heralding every movement with rolling thunder. In the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, entire cities shuddered as American formations turned factories into twisted ruins. But beyond the strategic targets, the battlefield itself bore the brunt. In the Hürtgen forest, where German divisions had fought with grim determination, convoys carrying ammunition and winter equipment were shattered in clearing after clearing. Soldiers huddled in bunkers heard the endless hum above and wrote in their diaries of a dread worse than artillery. Because artillery could be answered, but the bombers were beyond reach. The Wehrmacht's leaders sought to draw confidence from Hitler's promise of new wonder weapons. Yet even as jet prototypes and rockets appeared on paper, the immediate reality was columns wiped from the map in daylight. The contrast between fantasy weapons and the very real destruction overhead gnawed at morale. General Hasso von Manteuffel later admitted, "We spoke of miracles, but the Americans delivered factories in the sky." A particularly chilling report came from a German engineer battalion retreating from the Saar. As they attempted to construct makeshift bridges across a river, waves of bombers arrived in sequence, each stick of bombs erasing hours of labor. Survivors recalled the sensation of futility. Every hammer stroke, every timber laid, gone in an instant. "We worked like ants," one sergeant testified after the war, "and they swept us away with the back of a hand." By late November, the American raids had taken on a rhythm that ground down even hardened veterans. There was no safety, no pause, no reprieve. To the men of the Wehrmacht, the laughter of 1943 seemed not just naive, but delusional. Flying fortresses were no longer jokes or propaganda targets. They were the grim certainty above, the heralds of a war slipping beyond their grasp. December 1944, as the Ardennes offensive began, German high command gambled on one last bold stroke. The plan depended on surprise, on rapid thrusts of armor through snow-clad forests, and above all, on winter weather grounding Allied air power. For the first days, fog and snow gave them cover. Columns pushed forward, villages fell, and once more the Wehrmacht dreamed of reversing the tide. But on December 23rd, the skies cleared. American ground troops spoke of looking up from their foxholes and cheering as formations of B-17 and B-24s reappeared, engines echoing across the frozen landscape. For German soldiers, the effect was the opposite. The sudden return of bombers turned their confident advance into a rout. Convoys strung along narrow forest roads became perfect targets. Bombs fell with crushing accuracy, blasting trees into splinters, hurling tanks sideways into ditches, reducing supply lines to smoldering wreckage. Captured reports from the 2nd Panzer Division described the devastation. "We advanced under cover of fog, but when the sky opened, the Americans destroyed us in hours. Trucks with fuel, columns of infantry, all gone. Our offensive died in the snow." Survivors remembered the ground trembling like an earthquake, snow blasted into black ash, and men running without direction, deafened and blinded by the concussions. The Luftwaffe attempted to intervene, but its strength was spent. American escorts dominated the skies, and the few German fighters that rose were swept aside. Commanders who had assured their men that the Ardennes would be Germany's counterstroke now faced the bitter truth. Once the bombers returned, no plan could survive. For the Wehrmacht, the Ardennes became not just a failed offensive, but a final demonstration of American air supremacy. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. Every hope of maneuver, every chance of surprise, was hostage to the weather. The moment the skies cleared, the flying fortresses decided the battle. In that winter forest, the last illusion of German victory was buried beneath snow and shattered steel. January 1945. The remnants of the Ardennes offensive staggered back across the frozen fields of Belgium, their ranks thinned by cold, hunger, and above all, by the bombs that had fallen with relentless precision once the skies had cleared. German officers wrote in grim tones that it was not Allied infantry that had broken their strength, but the daily return of the American bombers. What little fuel remained had been consumed not by panzers driving forward, but by trucks fleeing burning roads cratered into impassable terrain. In Cologne, Aachen, and across the Rhine frontier, weary units tried to regroup. Yet the presence of the bombers hung over every assembly point. Soldiers who had once mocked the flying fortresses as barns in the sky now flinched at the faintest drone. "The sound means death," wrote a Feldwebel in his diary. "It begins as a hum and ends as a storm. We can fight tanks, we can fight men, but we cannot fight the sky." German commanders faced impossible choices. To concentrate reserves was to risk their annihilation by a single raid. To disperse forces meant they could never muster strength for counterattack. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine that had brought victory from Poland to France, was now a corpse. Movement belonged to the Allies. Daylight belonged to the Americans. Testimony from captured officers revealed their recognition of the new reality. General Major Rudolf Batz later admitted, "When the bombers came, every calculation ended. A division could vanish before its first shot. How does one command under such conditions?" By the end of January, with the Rhine defenses collapsing, even the most loyal officers whispered what they dared not say aloud months earlier. American bombers were not an auxiliary to battle. They were the battle. The laughter that had once greeted reports of flying factories was gone, replaced by a silence heavy with fear and the unshakable knowledge that the war had turned irreversibly against them. February 1945, the devastation reached a scale that even German commanders, hardened by years of war, could barely comprehend. As the Allies prepared their final drive to the Rhine, the U.S. 8th Air Force unleashed raids of unprecedented size. Thousands of bombers crossed the channel in waves, their contrails weaving a white ceiling that stretched from horizon to horizon. Civilians in cities and soldiers in the fields alike described it as a second sky above the first. For the Wehrmacht, every attempt to maneuver was instantly punished. Columns of armor concealed in valleys, ammunition dumps hidden in barns, rail yards hurriedly repaired under cover of darkness. All became infernos within hours of detection. The Allied intelligence network worked hand in hand with the bomber fleets. Where reconnaissance pointed, destruction followed. "No bridge lasted more than a day," admitted one German engineer officer in post-war interrogation. "We built at night, and by noon, it was rubble again." The raids on Dresden, though remembered for their civilian toll, also carried a message to the German military. Nowhere was beyond reach. Units retreating eastward watched as entire cities became rolling seas of fire, their paths choked with refugees and burning debris. Soldiers wrote home, those who still could, that their war no longer resembled combat at all. "We marched through smoke, through ruins, through rivers of glass. The enemy is not before us, but above us," wrote a private of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division. Even among high command, once so dismissive of American industrial warfare, the tone shifted to resignation. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring confessed privately to his staff that February, "The Americans have achieved with machines what we once believed only men could accomplish. They move whole armies not with legs, but with factories." By the end of the month, the Wehrmacht was no longer fighting to win battles. It was fighting for survival on roads that could be erased at any moment. Each raid reinforced the same truth. The flying fortresses were no longer just aircraft. They had become the embodiment of a new kind of war, where industry itself descended from the sky to dictate the fate of nations. March 1945. The Rhine stood as Germany's final natural barrier. A river commanders insisted would stall the Allied tide. German staff officers calculated that even the vast American supply system would need weeks to prepare bridging operations. They reassured their troops that the Rhine would buy time. Time to rebuild defenses, time to summon reserves, time for miracle weapons to arrive. But when the U.S. 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact on March 7th, the illusion shattered. Within hours, bombers filled the skies above the crossing. German artillery crews, ordered to destroy the bridge, found themselves bracketed by high-altitude formations, raining ordnance with machine-like precision. Batteries vanished in rolling blasts, their guns silenced before they could fire more than a few rounds. Witnesses on the ground recalled the sight of the bridge under constant attack, not from German efforts to demolish it, but from American fighters and bombers protecting and expanding the crossing. Columns of reinforcements racing to the river were shredded before they reached the east bank. "We marched to retake the bridge," one captured lieutenant later testified. "But by the time we arrived, there was no column left, only fragments burning on the road." American engineers, shielded by the relentless umbrella of air power, threw new spans across the Rhine in record time. Within 10 days, dozens of crossings appeared, some floating, some steel, all guarded by bombers patrolling above like sentinels. For German troops watching from shattered positions, the psychological blow was unbearable. What they had believed an impregnable line had been crossed not with weeks of buildup, but with a combination of audacity on the ground and domination from the air. By the end of March, the Rhine, the last great hope of defensive war, was no longer a shield. It was a grave marker. German generals who once scoffed at American bombers now admitted what their men already knew. The flying fortresses had not only broken armies and cities, but had erased the very concept of secure ground. The river that was to save Germany had become the pathway to its final collapse, paved by fire from the sky. April 1945, the war neared its end, but the bombers did not relent. With the Rhine crossed, German forces fell back into a homeland already devastated from the air. Cities that once symbolized industry, Essen, Kassel, Mannheim, lay in ruins. Rail networks functioned only in fragments, every major junction a cratered wasteland. For the Wehrmacht, this meant collapse not just at the front, but in the rear. Ammunition never arrived, fuel convoys were annihilated before reaching the lines, and even food for the troops was a luxury too scarce to imagine. German soldiers spoke of living under a ceiling of steel. Every day, the horizon filled with contrails as bomber formations passed overhead. Some were bound for factories, others for troop concentrations, still others for bridges not yet destroyed. "It no longer matters what target they choose," wrote one corporal of the 11th Panzer Division. "They destroy everything between the front and home." Letters captured from the front revealed despair deeper than exhaustion. "We march through a land that no longer exists," one infantryman confessed. "The Americans have erased the map." The psychological toll surpassed even the material destruction. Survivors of raids described a paralysis among men who once prided themselves on discipline. Orders to move by day were quietly ignored, as troops clung to ditches and forests rather than risk the open road. Generals complained that entire battalions were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by fear of the bombers overhead. At OKW headquarters, where optimism had once been sustained by promises of counterattacks, staff officers now spoke in whispers of inevitability. Reports circulated, noting that America had achieved a tempo of production and destruction no army in history had matched. Every week that Germany fought on was another week of annihilation from the air. By April's end, the sight of American bombers was no longer merely a military event. It was the daily confirmation of defeat, written across the skies of a collapsing Reich. The flying fortresses, once scorned as clumsy failures, had become the most visible symbol of Germany's undoing. Factories with wings, carrying the weight of an entire nation's industrial might straight into the heart of the battlefield.